Thank you very much, first of all, to you all for joining us today, both our panelists and our viewers. And welcome to FO Live, brought to you by Fair Observer with me, Claire Price, to discuss Africa's colonial legacy. For centuries, Europeans raided Africa. They saw it as a land for exploitation. They took slaves, they engaged in a scramble for Africa, and they stole both its land and its resources. So the question is, in 2022, can and does Africa determine its own destiny, or is it trapped by its colonial past? We're joined by a fantastic panel today. So first up, we have Professor Olufemi Taiwo, who hails from Nigeria but now works at Cornell University in the US, where he's Professor of African Political Thought and Chair at the Africana Studies and Research Center. Natasha Umanzi joins us from Rwanda, where she's a development consultant with a passion for improving education systems in Africa. And Martin Plout is a former Africa editor at the BBC World Service and a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and King's College London. Unfortunately, Rose Sang wasn't able to join us as we'd hoped originally. We would love to hear from you, both our panelists and our viewers. So please do put your questions in the chat box so that I can ask them to our panel. FO Live is brought to you by Fair Observer, which is a platform for citizen journalism with over 2,500 contributors from 90 different countries. And we would love you to join the conversation. So please do sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our channel, and of course you can publish with us too. It might be worth a mention at this stage that we are looking for more writers and editors from the African continent. So that's a particular call out in regards to today's discussion. So let's just start with a question for you, Professor, or Femi, as you want to be called today. You've just written a book called Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously, which actually prompted this discussion. And in it, you argue that decolonization has become a catch-all trope, which suffocates African thought and denies African agency. Could we just ask for you to just explain what you mean by that and just define your term decolonization? What does that actually mean to you?
Thank you very much, Claire, if I may. And I want to thank my co-panelists, Natasha and Martin. I hope Rose is feeling much better soon. And thanks to you, the audience, for spending time with us. I hope my concern always is that when people decide to spend time with me in settings like this, that they don't go away thinking they've wasted their time. So I hope that what we do here today actually rewards, even if only partially, your time. And that's my commitment. I wrote this book because at some point I discovered that decolonization have become so ubiquitous, everywhere you turn, somebody is decolonizing something. And soon, as I like to joke, I am sure somebody has already written, or will soon write on how to decolonize boiling water. That is how it has become. And then I look at Africa and the whole business of decolonization rests on two fundamentally faulty basis. One, it looks at contemporary situation in Africa and makes it seem as if the problems, the issues can all be attributed to the continuing power of colonialism in African lives. That is not just false, it's very dangerous. Two, by making that the case, what then happens is that colonialism becomes the pole from which people plot Africa's history. Historically, that is demonstrably false. There is no part of Africa, and please hear me out, there is no part of Africa where colonialism lasted for more than 100 years. So if Africa is indeed the home of humanity, to then talk about African history as if it has only 3 periods, pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial, is to do violence to the integrity of African life from the beginning of time to the beginning of colonialism. And I dare say that Africa is the only place where its scholars, both African and non-African, periodize its history that way. So I once asked a young South African historian, how many titles have you run into about pre-colonial Asia? And he said, oh, but people write about pre-colonial India. I say, India is a country, Asia is a continent, as Africa is. So, and colonialism also took place in Asia. So why is Asian history not, yes, not periodized by colonialism? Now, contrast what I just said with what happened in the Iberian Peninsula, where all of current-day Spain, all of current-day Portugal, and almost 3/5 of current-day France were all under Moorish rule for 700 years.
So I don't want to condense your thoughts too much, but you're saying that the decolonizing movement overstates the impact of colonialism on the African continent.
Absolutely. Actually, it's not just overstate, sometimes they misstate.
Okay. I'm sure that we'll come back to a lot of those ideas you've raised, but just to bring in the other members of the panel, if I can go to you, Natasha, you're involved in improving education systems. Does that involve this decolonizing education movement? And what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Claire. And it's kind of like a little bit intimidating going after Femi. He's given a whole lot of like thoughts to it. And, you know, some of them are really they are really eye-opening and challenging to my own beliefs. And, you know, now I'm like, oh, maybe I should go and like rethink some of my positionalities on this. But my prism, especially when it comes to decolonization, has a lot of the time focused on education and what I think it means for especially the education system on the African continent. And for me, putting it simply, I believe that decolonization for me means simply the inclusion of everything that Professor Femi was talking about prior to colonialism. You know, we need to learn our history. We need to create environments that produce or provide a multitude of perspective and opportunities for new narratives on the African history, on what being African means, on what Africa as a continent and African countries individually are, you know, what are the significance of the borders and all of that stuff. So basically kind of like going back to understanding our own histories prior to colonization. I do agree that a lot of our history has been tainted with this period in time that like you were saying, that only lasted no more than 100 years. But essentially, I believe that the fact that it has been entailed so much in defining what Africa is and who Africans are, it has kind of like eradicated the contributions that we've made to modernity, to civilization, right? And those are not talked about enough on the African continent in the African education system. And I say that because I believe for a long time we've been focusing on this like universal understanding of things, but I think that colonization is creating a space for multiple you know, epistemologies, multiple sources of knowledge, and crediting those that have for a long time not been credited or acknowledged or even appreciated.
Okay, Femi, I'll come to you, Martin, in a minute, but if you can just respond a bit, Femi, perhaps to Natasha's thoughts there, particularly that there's still some work to do basically in education to decolonize it.
Only if colonialism is the cause of the problem, or colonialism helps us to make sense of the continuation of the problem. And on both counts, it's not the case. Maybe I can introduce the distinction I make in the book between two senses of decolonization. Decolonization for me should be limited to the struggle for independence. When we stopped being colonies and became independent countries. People like to say, oh, we only got flag independence. But I'm telling people, flag independence means that Barbados just told Britain, we are going to be Republican henceforth, and Britain cannot do anything about it. Okay? And Nigeria signed a defense pact with Britain, surreptitiously before independence. And once people knew about it, very close to the independence period, they mobilized about it. The leader of the opposition in the federal parliament said, we cannot have this kind of defense pact with Britain and so on and so forth. It was abrogated within 3 years of Nigeria's independence. So all this point about flag independence doesn't mean anything, flies in the face of the fact that the people who are saying that are not traveling on British passports. They are not traveling on French passports. And when they get to wherever they are going, they expected to be treated as the citizens of those quote unquote fake countries with all that pertains to that. So my point is that decolonization 2, as I call it in the book, that tries to explain culture, politics, everything, and all that, that is the decolonization that I want us to get rid of yesterday.
Martin, let's bring you in. What are your thoughts on this? Do you see decolonization as something that took place 50 years ago and we can all move on, or are there still some remnants of colonial rule or colonial influence that we need to get rid of?
Well, there are lots of influences, and whether they are the Wagner Group or the Chinese who are arriving with huge sums of money to develop bits of Africa and get it into debt. I mean, you never get rid of influences. Influences are there forever and have been ever since people began trading with each other. So, I mean, it's absolutely clear that there'll never be no influence. That's just a non sequitur. But on the specifics, I mean, for me, the most interesting country is one that I got to quite late in life, but, I've been working on for, I suppose, about 30 years, is Ethiopia, where you have, which is an amazing place. And of course, unlike a lot of other sub-Saharan Africa countries, has a vast literary history because they had a written language. And it was reserved for a minority. It was the priestly language of the Giz script, but nonetheless it was there, and they can trace their lineages and their history back hundreds of years, and that is so fascinating. But then, of course, you also have the problem of how you look at Ethiopia, and if you are a Highland Ethiopian, you may look at it one way. And if you are somebody from the south, you look at it a very different way, because Menelik expanded the empire in the 1880s, doubled it, trebled it in size, and took into huge numbers of peoples. Now, there was colonialism. I mean, last year there was a unity of the Tigrayans that had an alliance with some of the other southern groups, and one of the Oromo said, I have been enslaved and treated like a slave all my life. And he didn't mean by whites. So, Africa is a hugely complex place, but in the end, it comes down to agency. And I completely agree with Femi, because, if you believe that you're still trapped in colonialism, it's a bit like being on a psychiatrist's couch for the rest of your life. You're never going to escape. Frankly, Africa is what Africans will make of it. Of course, there are outside influences. I'm not denying that for a single second. Some that come from the past, some that come from the present, some will be imposed on the future. There are many things which are good or bad, but Africa is what it is, and it must seize its future and make what it is. And this talk about the past like this, I think, is a complete dead end.
Oh, interesting that you gave the analogy there of a psychologist's couch, because obviously psychologists do try and analyze the past of a particular patient to understand the present. So perhaps we can't just ignore that past. It does need to be dissected. I don't know what.
But just one point. When you're on with a psychoanalyst, so I should have said psychoanalyst, you frequently are there for 30 or 40 years and never escape. That's what I'm trying to get.
Right. So Femi, you believe we need to get off that couch and start to using it?
Actually, this is the point for me, and I'm glad that Martin has brought in Ethiopia. Okay, Ethiopia, as we know it today, is the product of colonization. Okay, and a lot of the decolonizing discourse never talks about internal colonialism in Africa. It's as if colonialism was something that was brought from outside, and that is another, eliding of African agency, because people are not paying attention to the complexities of life and thought through the millennia of African history. I was just saying to a friend yesterday, the Nguni movement, the expansion of the Zulu Empire, all the way to present-day Zimbabwe, where you have the Ndebele, who are actually Zulu, was not something that was, had anything to do with European colonialism. Two, South Africa had settler colonialism originally. British colonialism brought a different flavor because the Dutch did not colonize native Africans in South Africa. They wanted the land. That's the logic of settler colonialism. They wanted to clear the land of the people so that they can have it to themselves. The British came and colonized both the Boers and the local people. So if you're talking about decolonizing, the Boers also have an interest in decolonizing in South Africa. So they probably want to have Stellenbosch, not have to teach any British person. And they probably want to remove from Orange Free State, all those British statutes, of people who whip their asses, back in the day. So again, these are the kinds of complexities. And the past, yes, must be taken care of. But please don't reduce that past to a one-dimensional pre-colonial frame. At different times, Africans were experimenting with all kinds of forms. It was not only Ethiopia. In the medieval period, Mali was a constitutional experiment that still has implications for how we think about governance and legitimacy anywhere in the world today. You can't find that in decolonizing discourse.
Natasha, let me bring you in again. I just want to maybe talk about a specific incident, which obviously is now about 5 years ago, the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, where students at the University of Cape Town were pulling down the statue of Rhodes and saying that we need to decolonize education. Obviously, as the professor and as Martin have said, decolonization is so complex a topic. Do you think that campaign simplified things to the point that it just became a little bit meaningless, or do you think that they actually had a valid point?
Thanks again, Claire. But if you would allow me, prior for me talking about the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, would it be fine for me to kind of like get a few points in? Because I think that what we're arguing here is the validity of this decolonization debate, right? And the fact that a lot of the time being one-dimensional and reducing the agency that Africans have, I I think that that is part of coloniality and the legacies that it brought, right? Because, for example, one of the, looking at education system and like taking myself as a younger person, remembering in like, in grade school, for example, being punished for speaking my native tongue during like a break because our native tongue was not allowed on school premises, right? That there's no way you can say that that was the agency of the school, the agency of the teacher to punish the students because of their spoken their mother tongue. But there is a reason why they associated foreign language with intellectual settings, right? And not our mother tongue. So I believe that even though we really need to move the conversation from pointing fingers to where the problem originated from, and we need to start focusing on what we can potentially do to find solutions to not only producing or exercising our agency as Africans, but also producing the kind of like mentality, the kind of narratives that are going to support this kind of like agency that we've been, the agency that's going to produce the decisions that we're looking at, right? So I believe that there's no way that we can create a future or create or perceive a vision without necessarily addressing and seeing and recognizing the legacies that are there that are still permeating in everyday life, right? That were existing. Now, coming to the roads must fall question, that I mean, that's really my opinion. Obviously, I feel like there is a whole lot more. Maybe I should read Professor's book to kind of like get a better grasp on this and on his argument. But I really think that dismissing it almost or saying that let's leave it in the past, number one, it does not allow for like maybe even the future generation, even my generation, to really contemplate the legacies that it had in order for us to move past them, right? In order for us to truly start exercising our agencies as our own, rather than something that has perhaps been influenced upon us. And obviously we cannot get rid of all influences, but I believe that perhaps we really need to weed some of them out, really change the narrative, and also create perspective that will allow for this agency to be an African agency rather than one that's anyway. I digress. So I think when it comes to like campaigns like Roads Must Fall, I believe that they are they almost serve as an advertisement, like an awareness campaign. And I believe that they re-energized people of my generation and maybe even the future generation to start caring about these issues again. Now, I believe that just like any other campaign, or any other movement, they are usually very popular and filled with like catchy slogans, but at the end of the day, if no real change in terms of policy and access and inclusion of the diverse sources of knowledge, and really the dismantling of power structures that are already existing in the environment that we're discussing, then all we really do is just wait for the next movement to start and reawaken this passion. However, I do believe that they're not really hindering the movement, because they are infusing new minds with like the passion to kind of like study these issues and delve deeper. I would say
Can I come in here? Because I mean, really, I think this is so mistaken, if I may. I mean, it really is really wrong. And I'll tell you why. I mean, that statue was at my university. That's where I grew up. And I walked past it every single day when I went to university. And every single day it made me feel uncomfortable, because I knew what Rhodes's role was in the past. And every day that I felt uncomfortable was good for me. And one of the great problems with this movement is that it does exactly what you say. It weeds out the influences. so students feel comfortable. That is not why we go to university. We go to university to be challenged, to hear ideas we don't agree with, to confront them intellectually, to move beyond them, and to sometimes then understand that we are wrong and that they were right in the first place. Let me give you one specific example about Rhodes, who I opposed all my life. I opposed his ideas. He was dead by the time I was there. One specific issue. He actually, towards the end of his life, was the person who was on the left of politics. He actually passionately supported the idea that everybody, it was only men, because I'm afraid the vote at that time was only for men. All civilized men should have the vote, irrespective of color. That was his actual position. And he was up against people who actually said people of color shouldn't have the vote. And he said, no, anybody should have the vote. Now, this has just been thrown out with this whole stupid movement, which has ended up denying the past, denying these issues. We should accept them and reject them at the same time. We should engage with them, and we should not hope to live in an intellectual environment which is comfortable.
And I agree with what you're saying, Martin. And perhaps maybe I did not come across clear, but I'm not saying that I agree with the Rose Must Fall and like removing any indication or revising the past. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we need movements like this that are going to kind of like become very flashy and catchy in order to awaken younger people who have not necessarily perhaps even wondered about the kind of man Rhodes was and what he represented, right? Because with that said, it's going to then force us almost, because I became interested in decolonization post this movement. Once I started, I was like, what is this all about, right? Why do we feel the necessity to have to dismantle the past? I mean, he existed and he donated to the schools. There's a reason why his statue was erected, but why was that? And what does that mean for me as an African student? Does that mean the fact that he is at my university, that my university agrees with some of the horrors perhaps that is associated with his name? Does that mean they agree with that? And then it engages us to have this kind of debates, right? And if that is all it does, it's enough. But I believe that if we could create the kind of passion and zeal in young people, in young minds, that we had almost during independence, where young people all over Africa were meeting and discussing and having conversations, then I believe we can actually move some of these issues further forward. I am not a believer in taking down monuments, because what does that do? You know, you're just going to erect another one, right? And in the future, someone is going to disagree with you, and it's really just a waste of stone. But what it should do is that it should almost force the next generation to want to deal or to want to face head on with the past in order to figure out what are some of the things from our past that are having an impact in our present, and how can we address them in order to create the future that we want to see. That's really what I was saying. And that's why I almost called it an awareness campaign, an advertisement of some sort. But at the end of the day, I believe that such flashy movements, at the end of the day, just end up there. You know, they come, the statue is removed, and then nothing is changed. There's no systematic change. There's no change. There's no status quo that has been like dismantled, and we move on to the next issue. Whereas I believe we need to sit in the discomfort, like you were saying, and actually address what really bothered us to start the movement in the beginning.
Natasha, thanks for defending your position there. We've got a question here, and in fact, he's joining us on the camera. So if you can just introduce yourself and tell us who the question is for, please.
Sure. My name is Joseph Thabo. So Nelson Mandela, he didn't come an angry man. He didn't try to kick out the white people or to get angry to create conflict. And under him, it was socially stable and economically very stable South Africa. Now it's being ruled by the Black entity. However, we see that it is economically bankrupt and socially unstable. What would be your perspective in this? So I conclude by saying that Africa, the only solution that I see is that Africa needs to go back to colonialism.
Oof. Femi?
There's absolutely no basis for that. And again, it represents a profound ignorance of colonialism. People really do need to study. I'm sorry. I don't do sentiment. I don't do identity. I don't do all those things. Africa needs all the thinking, you know, and what I just had now does not bring any thinking to the table. Here's the problem. There are at least, and I wrote this 12 years ago, 3 different kinds of colonialism. You have settler colonialism. You have colonialism that is just driven by exploitation alone. And then you have a hybrid colonialism that is settler plus colonialism. All those 3 that I've just mentioned are colonialism in the modern age. Okay? In ancient history, in the medieval period, people keep forgetting. The United Kingdom, as we know it today, was a colony. France, as we know it today, was a colony. Greece got its independence as a colony from Turkey, you know, from the Ottoman Empire in 1821. So colonialism is a global phenomenon. So if you now want to talk about, you know, we want South Africa to be returned to colonialism, which colonialism are you talking about? And, you know, if it was so successful and all that, why did people who lived under it say that, no, this is not really serving us? And to think that the only thing we have to worry about, and many people used to say this about Africa, oh, Africa should not worry about democracy, we just need to put food on the table. That is the attitude you take to your pets. When you turn people into just their bellies, you have completely dehumanized them, okay? And that is why you find many people in all cultures where people are poor, but instead of eating what they would consider to be the bread of sorrow, they would rather die. And Africans are human in exactly that way. So please don't bring that kind of stuff, you know, to somebody like me. I'm sorry. Colonialism destroyed everything it touched in the continent. As I was telling people yesterday, Africans wanted to go capitalist. Colonial authorities, German colonial authorities in Cameroon, British colonial authorities in Kenya forbade Africans from growing tea because they did not want them to compete, you know, with white settlers. German colonial officials burned down, you know, Cameroonian oil palm plantations because they did not want them, you know, to compete, you know, with whatever. So when people now say that, oh, colonialism brought capitalism, no, colonialism used the base to furnish their own capitalism, but they prevented Africans from exercising agency to choose to go capitalist because they would have been competing with corporations from the metropolis. So again, we need to know our history to know how these things unfolded. Meanwhile, what kinds of demands were Africans making? We want to be in control of ourselves. That's what agency is about. But then when you are in control of yourself, you can drop the ball big time. Agency does not mean that you'll always make the right choices. It means that you make wrong choices, and when you do, please own them. Don't displace them onto other people. Otherwise, you'll be a child permanently.
Yeah, I think probably we can ignore the thrust of the last question, apart from the economy aspect, which I do want to delve into a little bit more. And Martin, as a journalist, you traveled across the African continent. You've seen a lot of those economic problems firsthand. Basically, is that all to do with colonialism, or are there deeper roots, and what's to be done about that?
Well, I think there are deep. They're much deeper roots, but I mean, if you're going to really debate why there's this problem, it is a hard one. I mean, to be fair to the previous speaker who came on, I mean, economically, there's no doubt that Zimbabweans were better off under Ian Smith, and even the current South African government accepts that the education system was superior under apartheid when it was meant to keep Black people ignorant, which is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, what a thing to say about your own country. I mean, but I'm completely with Femi on this. You know, colonialism was a total dead end. It was never going. I'm utterly opposed to it. But to answer your point about how does one explain, and it's a very simple one. When I did economics in the 1960s, there was a very simple kind of graph that people used to say, look, Kenya, Tanzania, more or less at the same level as Malaysia, Singapore, and the other, South Korea. And gradually the two diverged. And we have to explain that. And I find it very difficult to explain because, they both had different problems and different sets of problems that they had to grasp with, but we have to explain it. And I must be honest with you, I've never had a really successful explanation of why Africa has, it's been successful in many things, but it has not economically been a huge success overall and in the main, except when you get to an extractive industry country like Botswana, where, hey, they just had to dig up the diamonds and the various other chemicals, and it was a small population. So one has to answer that question, and I've never come up with a good answer to it. And just to go back to say, well, it's colonialism. Well, then why do other countries which had colonialism, why have they taken off? And you can't explain it.
But could you say that colonial injustices live on in the form of globalization?
In what way? That's a sort of metaphysical view of the world. What
well, in the sense that
it disappeared like an ether in the universe and has descended. Why? And what do you mean? It means nothing.
No.
The inequality. Oh, sorry, Femi, go on.
Inequality everywhere.
Well, true.
Let me just say this. Have Africans not been globalizing? That's another false, description that people run with. Africans have been globalizing too. You now have African restaurants, in some of the snazziest places all around the world. That's African agency. Africans move like other people move. Africans have always moved, in the world. So when you then turn globalization into something that Europeans do to the rest of us, then you are not going to understand, why you now have all of a sudden, Indians ruling Silicon Valley in the United States. That's globalization. And India is an ex-colony, isn't it?
No, indeed. Okay. I think the question economically is asking really why African nations haven't really ascended the global value chain in the sense that they export commodities and they import goods and services, and they could be doing more.
That is where agency comes in. Again, I've dealt with this in a different way, okay? When Africa begins to take modernity seriously, everything is going to change. And please, I'm not going to be able to flesh this out, but South Korea went out, they actually had a deliberate program and they set an agenda. Their goal was several years down the road, they wanted to become members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. They missed it by 2 years. And you know why they missed it by 2 years? Because they had not committed 0.7% of their GDP to foreign aid. And who are the recipients of foreign aid? Africans are now dancing, to get arms from South Korea. South Korea has only 3 natural resources: iron ore, tungsten, and fish. 64% of the country is rock. South Korea became a global economic power. Everybody says, oh, but the US was pumping money there, and all that. So all the money that was pumped into Zaire under Mobutu, where did it go? Okay, why is it that, Africans will just, and I need to read something to you, which is in the book, but this audience needs to hear it. This is Olufemi Awolowo, one of our important intellectuals that nobody pays attention to, both in and out of the decolonizing movement, and one of the most important thinkers of the last century in the area of political philosophy, bar none. Okay, he said this in 1973. The struggle against involuntary political and economic enslavement under colonial rule was over during the last decade in most parts of Africa. But the struggle against voluntary subservience and submission to neocolonialism is yet to begin. Our frequent and unabating declamation against neocolonialism appears to me to be pretentious exercise and deliberate diversion. For the true and real neocolonialists are no other than we Africans ourselves. It is we, in spite of our political independence and sovereignty, who voluntarily submit to economic and sometimes diplomatic dominance from outside our borders. Now, Awolowo was the reason that I got an education in Nigeria. Because before colonialism was out, he became premier of my region in Nigeria, and in 1955, put in a universal free primary education scheme in that region, even while colonialism lasted. He never became president of Nigeria. No. Let's take our history seriously. Again, between him and Nkrumah, they ran the two most progressive regimes in the history of Africa to date. They dreamt, especially Awolowo, dreamt big. But then he was working within Nigeria, and we all know where Nigeria is now.
Natasha, if I can come to you, you got your hand up. Can I put a question to you, or do you have a point to make first?
No, I actually had a question for Femi.
Yes, please.
If I may, I mean, what you just said is something that I pound on and I wonder about quite often. And you're right. There is this like voluntary subjugation that we have, that Africans, even some that we have. So I'm just wondering, is that implicit or explicit? Is it something that is done consciously? Is it a choice that we make, or is it done subconsciously? And if so, how do we then move beyond that? And not just on an exemplary, exceptional basis. How is it that we can then transcend more generally, like as African, to transcend that, right? Rather than like picking out, and pointing out and making people extraordinary for having done that. How do we make that the norm? Because I think it really all delves down to the perspective that we have of ourselves. How do we change that, right? And the perspective largely that we have of ourselves, even though we don't want to kind of like dwell in the past, some of that is influenced largely by the legacies and the impact that colonialism has had, right? Both on the education system. A lot of the countries still use the same system, still use the same content, right? That was installed during that time. So I'm just really trying to figure out what you're saying is great, but then how is that implemented? How does that translate into us moving forward?
Can I respond? Yes, thank you very much, Natasha. You just put your finger. And my point is, Africa does not have a singular history. The man that I just mentioned is just an example of a movement that younger people now are being blocked from reading, because people who argue like that are dismissed as people who are still suffering from, to use a word that you used earlier that I would never recognize, from the coloniality of being. Once you say that, you turn it into an eternal category, you turn it into an ontology. Meanwhile, all these other places that I've just mentioned They looked at other places and said, you know, we can do that too. But people like me who counsel that in Africa, we are called all sorts of names. We are Europologists. A colleague once said that I'm eating Europhilic shit. You know, yes, that's another professor who said that to me. You know, and then we tell people, oh, you don't read all those Des Dwight, whatever it is. China is spending billions of dollars to translate materials from everywhere in the world so that young people will have a link to the resources of the human heritage. But your Africans are telling you, oh, we must look into our past. Many of the people that I study, they did that. Cecily Hayford, Africanus Houghton, Edward Blyden, there's none of them that was not better grounded in the history of Africa than all the young people who are running around now, you know, telling us that we only need to read. And they don't read those people because they are marked as ex-colonials. So my point is that if you and other people that you work with and all that really want to see how we can begin to move this forward, we got to stop looking outwards, to stop looking at people, you know, that we are saying, oh, you did this to us, you did that. They don't care. It's not their concern. I don't write my books for, you know, for white people or Europeans or whatever it is. I write my books for people who want to be educated, and I hope that my book gives them insights from wherever in the world they come, starting with Africans. And yes, I work with everybody. I read and I work on Africa. And I don't do it, you know, with decolonizing, because colonialism is a small part. It's completely irrelevant. And under colonialism, this may surprise you, Natasha, but let me just say this. In northern Nigeria and parts of my part of Nigeria, it was actually the colonial authorities who did not want English taught. They just want English taught enough so that people can become clerks and all that. Because Lugard said that Africans were not the kind of people who could be modern, they had to be kept, even if they didn't want to be, in what he called their African state. And it was to break through that, because many of our leaders knew that Africans are global, they will have to deal with the global world and so on and so forth, and they cannot do so just remaining, you know, tied. So I learned French, I learned Yoruba, I learned English. People before me studied Latin, and I am perfectly bilingual. Thank you.
Martin, any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I can only agree. I mean, interestingly, if you look at South Africa again, the early people in the ANC and outside of the ANC in the early 1900s were amazingly well educated. I mean, somebody like Sol Plaatje, who translated Shakespeare into Tswana language, Dr. Abdurrahman, who most people have never heard of, who was an astonishing leader of the so-called colored population, who was himself the grandson of a slave, came and was educated, became a doctor in Glasgow, and went back and spent his whole life fighting against racism. In fact, was asked to lead a delegation of Indian people to India and met the viceroy. And, you know, I mean, somebody who changed the world in many ways. Now largely forgotten. I must admit I've written a biography about him, which of course I'm now wishing to push. But so there are, you know, the amazing people, you know, I very much accept what Femi talks about globalization. I'll tell you one of the proudest things that I have about living where I do in this part of London is that we now have 5 Africans on our local council. I don't mean Afro-Caribbeans, I mean Africans, people, a Ghanaian, an Algerian, somebody from Congo, from South Sudan, and a Somali lady. And these people are leading our community here. They're leading their own communities, but they're leading everybody in the community. And, you know, these are the people who are making our world. And if you look at just one other thing, ask yourself, who is really going to change Africa? It is people I must be honest, inside Africa, but also people outside Africa, people in the diaspora who are sending, I think it's 2 or 3 times the money back as remittances to their own families. They are cutting through any of these ties. They're not interested in colonialism. They're interested in their grandmother and making sure that their grandchild can be educated. These are people who are going to change the continent.
Okay, we will probably just have a few final thoughts before we wrap up. There's been a bit of a debate on the chat here about African restaurants. You'll be interested to know whether that really can be a sign of, Africans engaging in globalization. But a few people have sort of said, well, this is all well and good, but what now? Where do we go from here? Let me just find this question here. How can Africans escape the sort of colonialism of the mind and be truly independent? Perhaps we can just end with a few thoughts on that question from each of you. Who should we go with first? Natasha, any thoughts?
Thank you. I really think that for me, obviously, my interest is in education. It's, rethinking the education that Africans are engaging with, the knowledge that they're engaging with, and what kind of perspective and narrative that it's creating, not only within them, but the one that it's perpetuating, right? I believe that we should, look deeper, start to engage with in a more formalized manner, not necessarily that, we're waiting for grandma to come and tell us our folk tales, or in a more formal manner, we need to engage with our histories, with the indigenous knowledges. But also, I believe that part of changing Africans' minds is showing them that our knowledge has value, that it is acknowledged, and that means that knowledge produced in the global South in Africa has to be appreciated. It has to be valued in our education system, even beyond, right? And that we cannot only continue perpetuating knowledge that's produced, in the West, or produced by Africans in the West as knowledge that has merit. We need to promote and utilize and engage and actually promote the knowledge that's produced here on the continent, but also really change the education systems that we have in order to change our mindset and to change our perspective and allow for the creation of a multitude of narratives to exist.
Okay, Femi, your last few words here.
We are producing the knowledge, but decolonizers are not reading it because they are not interested in knowledge. I'm sorry. They are interested in the next invitation, in the next ticket, in all the positions that they are now settling into around here. That's the reason why I said they are trading the future of Africa for the pittances they are getting right now. Okay? Africa has always been a center of knowledge. This was the thesis of a TED talk that I gave in 2017. It's up there. Okay? So people are doing stuff all across Africa. And before us, people had been, I tell people, stop all this thing about pushing back against racism. Africanus Hutton was doing that in the 19th century. Young Africans don't even know of him. And he was a medical doctor, he was a surgeon, from King's College, there with you, Martin, and he wrote books, on political systems and all those things. Is anybody studying that stuff, of the people who are running around that roads must fall in South Africa? There are other thinkers, in Africa who have worked. Julius Nyerere, that people want to trot out as this, a fantastic, African, whatever it is. He translated Macbeth. He translated Julius Caesar. He was a practicing Catholic until he passed on. And the man was invested in liberal democracy. And all across Africa, you don't find people who are actually studying the fundamental principles that inform the systems that we're trying to set up. How are we going to get them right if we don't study?
Okay. Martin, last word from you then.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, but I think the one other thing that has to change is we cannot have the continent gripped in so many countries, by sclerotic, aged dictatorship. I mean, Nguema, more than 40 years. Paul Biya, nearly 40 years. Sassou Nguesso, Yoweri Museveni, Isaias Afwerki. I mean, all of them more than 3 decades. People must let go. And, the young people must take up the reins and run with it and show what Africa can be. And the one thing I've never been is pessimistic about Africa, because yes, people have a hard time and they really suffer, and I've seen it often, and then people are down. But most of the time, I always loved working with Africans and for Africa, is because Africans have an optimistic outlook in general and are engaged with their future and engaged and love their countries, and quite rightly too.
Okay, thank you so much to all of you, and also for the questions and the debate we've been having on the chat channel here as well. Just a quick plug for Fair Observer. FO Live is brought to you by Fair Observer, which is a platform for citizen journalism with 2,500 contributors from 90 different countries, and we would love you to join the conversation. So please do get in touch with us. Obviously, you can follow us on social media, you can write for us, and we're looking for more writers, more editors from the African continent. So please do get in touch. Thank you to all of you. Thanks.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you again, Claire. Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, Martin.
Okay.
I hope we continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.